What happens when a family doesn't look like each other? Not just in personality, but in the literal sense. We're referring to transracial adoptees. So, what does cultural competency look like when working with transracial adoptees and their families? And why might racial marrying be so important? And how might grief, trauma, and loss play a role for transracial adoptees? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sen. Our guest today is Lia Childress, a licensed associate counselor, a graduate from University of Arkansas with a master's in clinical psychology, and she specializes in supporting young adults and families to address challenges of anxiety and trauma through Gestalt interventions and mindfulness practices. Additionally, Lia has a unique focus on working with clients and families involved with transracial adoptions. Lia was also part of an inaugural campus walk and raised $18,000 for suicide awareness, which created the framework for that event. As an African American licensed associate counselor, Lia will be discussing cultural competence and working with populations involved with transracial adoptions and what that may look like. Lia, thank you so much for joining our show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Now, your work with transracial adoption, that is an organization and population that you're currently involved in. Is that correct?
Yes, it is a focus for me when it comes to providing therapy services.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the transracial adoption for our listeners. Do you want to talk about the adoption process briefly, or do you want
Mhm,
to talk about the adoptee's experience or the parent's
mhm.
experience?
I definitely want to focus on the adoptee experience just because we always hear about the other elements of creating the family, the adoption process, but I really would like to focus on the adoptee that is adopted transracially.
Okay. So, with that being said, in terms of transracial adoption, in terms of maybe clinicians who are working with the adoptees who are part of these adoptions, what might be some important considerations that we as clinicians should consider?
Yeah, so I there's a few like key elements that I always like to consider and then also advocate for whenever working with therapists and then also working with families. And cultural competency is the biggest. Just in order for the adoptee and the family to have a successful, cohesive unit, it is very important to be educated on transracial adoption, trauma, and what that will look like for someone who may have a different cultural background.
And so, when you say trauma, you mean in terms of the child's cultural history in
Yes.
relation to impact of trauma.
Yes. And a lot of people don't realize that trauma happens with every adoption because you are technically removing an individual from an environment and then abruptly placing them in another one, regardless of if it's for a very dangerous situation or if it's a amicable adoption where the families are have planned this and the children are aware. Any type of transformation or change is a type of abrupt trauma for the body.
Yeah. I can imagine that's especially with the different ages. I'm
Mm,
assuming these are younger children. At
mhm.
times, some are infants that are being
Yes.
adopted as well. And to be removed from that family of origin environment
Mhm.
is a form of trauma. Why don't you share with us some of these elements that you really like therapists or our listeners to know in terms of understanding the adoptee's experience and what we really want to hone in on as therapists?
Yeah. Okay. So I one thing that I always advocate for when it comes to doing therapy for the adoptee is the emphasis on racial mirroring. So does that adoptee have racial mirrors in their life? Will you be a type of racial mirror for this client? Will they feel comfortable enough to open up and discuss things that may impact them every day? Or are you capable of possibly evoking some of those emotions?
So that's the physical mirroring representation. And for therapists who aren't doing this internal work, that there's also
Mhm.
this internal mirror that needs to be reflected with the adoptee.
Yes. Yes, and I love my professors, they always told the clinicians that they were training of all backgrounds to talk about the elephant in the room. So, for example, if the clinician is of white descent, talk about that with that client. Like, hey, how does it feel for you to be talking about this racial struggles that I may not be able to relate to? And I have just seen and heard so many advantages of doing something like that, especially in the initial process. It just removes all of that tension. It helps clients maybe feel a little bit more comfortable with you because it's not a bad word to say the race or black or white, but for some reason in our cultural norms, we have kind of shied away or become so afraid to even mess up and talk about these things, but we're all humans.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, what are some other the other elements? Because I think
Yeah.
you have a few in mind.
Yes, yes. So the utilization of the client's experience is super important. So talking about what it's like for the client to look different from their family, to love these people that have embraced them and vice versa, but talking about the complex experience of not seeing or looking like your family. That is a whole nother dynamic that needs to be explored to successfully cultivate this comfortability of self and racial identity. So that's one that I feel like is super important. It kind of goes with the addressing the elephant in the room.
Yeah. That piece of pulling or encouraging clients to ask or explore, well, what is it like that my parents don't look like me? I
Mhm.
actually haven't heard much about that.
Yeah.
So that's such a key element that you're bringing up. Now, in your work with adoptees, what that conversation has looked like.
Yeah. Well, it is it's funny because whenever even I've had clients of mixed race descent, of different like Spanish descent, and one of the first things the parents have even said to me is, "Thank God." Looking at me, thank goodness, because they for some reason they feel more comfortable knowing that I'm going to be comfortable talking about race. So that's always the first thing that comes up in some shape or form. And after that, I kind of look at the the age development that we're working with. So in the teen years, that is when race and microaggressions and stereotypes are finally like their brain is starting to process this complex experience that they're having and having the terminology to talk about it. So around the teenage years, like 11, 12, that's kind of when I encourage the client to explore that because they are able to understand what's going on emotionally. Before that age group, I kind of focused on just age appropriate activities and encouraging the client to look at the positive and maybe not so positive experiences that they've had, even if me and that client are coloring.
So it's like many families when they send their children to
Mhm.
see you, they're saying, "Oh my gosh, thank goodness
Yeah,
you're comfortable talking about race."
yeah,
Uh, that's unfortunate, though.
It
Because,
is.
oh gosh.
I know that they mean well, but a lot of times I think that the assumption is that I can do the best work if I look closer to the client. And that's not always true. I think that the biggest thing that families and clinicians can do, well, first, families, they should look for someone who is adoption competent. There's a lot of great resources. I work a lot with like my company Identity, who is also affiliated with Case. And Case is a company that just creates resources and encourages all the competency when starting the adoption process. So, like I said, anyone can be adoption competent if they do the work and educate themselves, not just me.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Now, in addition to, this, I'm just thinking developmentally when you're working with the adoptees, once they reach the high
Hmm.
school age, it's much easier to
Hmm.
have conversations about
Yes.
microaggressions. And
Hmm.
tell me about these other tips and elements that you're looking for when you're just thinking and
Hmm.
exploring about cultural competence for transracial
Hmm.
adoptions.
Another thing is recognizing the impact of loss and grief. A lot of times, the adoptee is subliminally told to be grateful. And so they may not even recognize that it's okay to mourn the loss of their biological family. There is something that happened before they were adopted, and exploring the complex grief of that is highly encouraged because you cannot know where you're going if you don't know where you came from. And that is just grieving what they could have potentially lost is the start of that.
As you're talking about this concept of grief, I am just imagining a young adoptee, maybe a toddler age,
Yeah.
4 or 5, where they're already wondering, "Hey, I know this is my mom and dad, but something feels different." And of course, as they're
Yeah.
aging to maybe like 9 or 10,
Mhm.
really getting a sense that, where are my parents, like biological parents?
Mhm.
Mm,
How did I end up like where I am with this
yeah.
family that I adore and that takes care of me? That is when families address that early in the age appropriate ways, I feel like it will allow that adoptee to feel comfortable exploring that with the family, which is at the end of the day, as a transracial adoption therapist, that is what I encourage. I'm here to help and assist, but I can't do all the work. The family must be a part of this. So I often implement family sessions at least once or twice a month just to encourage a cohesive family unit. I am focusing on the adoptee, but my end goal is for the adoptee and the family to all feel like I am on their side. I am team family. Just making sure the family is team adoptee when it comes to exploring their racial identity and all the complex emotions that come with adoption.
Mm. You're directly working with the adoptee and you're giving the parents the tools.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. Super important because it's I hear the I think of the example, you can work on and nurse a flower back to health, but if you put it back into a pot of soil that's not also doing the work or also being nurtured, then there's really no point.
Yeah. So we have the loss and grief impact.
Yes.
What
Um,
else?
Encouraging culture exploration. So, and and integrating the entire family into this process. So, are you taking your child to the proper barber shop for them to get their hair cut? Because that's important because there's a lot of cultural talk in barbershop settings or just environments that mirror that racial identity. There are a lot of things that or Black History Month, going to an MLK parade together as a family to just celebrate this culture that is a part of the identity that is unique about this adoptee, my client. So that encouraging cultural exploration without the fear of saying or doing the wrong thing is super important, especially as a family unit.
So as a therapist, you're encouraging the client. Of course, depending on the age, if they're a young kiddo, they really don't have much say. But let's say they're in high school by this
Mhm,
time, you're really encouraging them to lean into these cultural celebrations. And for instance, like MLK March, which
mhm,
happens,
mhm.
every year. So take advantage of
Yeah,
that as part of Black History Month. So,
yeah.
okay. So yeah, for therapists to be very open
Mhm.
about and explicit about these
Yes.
conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, but beating around the bush does not help any of us or the adoptee. So why not just go into it, whether it's clean or messy? We're all imperfect. So it's just important for therapists to be willing to mess up and then also discuss that with their client. How do they feel about talking about something hard? Did the therapist use a term incorrectly? Did a therapist assume that, that this adoptee experiences something and they haven't? So yeah, these are all important when it comes to exploring and providing these resources to the client. And I think the last point that I would like to kind of tie in is addressing racism. It is something that sadly it exists. It exists here in America. It happens on different levels because it is a part of the norm and it has been passed down for decades. So I feel like exploring any times where the adoptee has had an assumption made, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, just kind of what that felt like for them and just giving them room to process these type of things. I'm thinking of an example of a client where they were telling me that there were assumptions made about what they listen to or what they like to wear. And when you come from a background that is different, more than likely you have multiple things that you like about different cultures. So just assuming that, a young man, a young Black adoptee likes to play basketball and he actually plays lacrosse. These are things that we have to be aware of.
Yeah. It's like the assignment of, we talk about this a lot about people of color and marginalized groups are pigeonholed into certain traits or typecast in
Yeah.
certain roles. And
Typecast, yes.
yeah. And it's so hard to break out of that.
Yeah. I noticed that it's an issue that we haven't really talked about either, where, for example, I noticed a client didn't really have any examples of Black individuals in media other than basketball or football. And they didn't know or even think, they were like, okay, I'm going to be a basketball player. And I was a little bit taken aback because I'm working with this young client and he is intelligent and, just all these different things. But because he's never seen it, he didn't even think to even explore those things. It's very important to do the extra work to have examples of all careers, of all types of possibilities that look like the adoptee, because automatically we're just going to assume, okay, this person does this, but whenever they are different colors or they don't reflect the same racial identity, they don't really subconsciously put themselves in those roles or as a possibility.
That must have been disheartening when you heard that adoptee say, I'm only going to focus on sports and I'm not looking into the arts or the sciences.
Yes. Yes. I think that was kind of I learned a lot from my clients, the way that they learn in my rooms, but we never learned about that in school. We didn't learn that you may deal with a client who, even if you're adoption focused, that they look at the media and they say, okay, this is the only way out. I never thought about that. And so that is something we sat with for a while, how this client got to this, because of course the parents didn't say that. They don't want that. They didn't say you are only going to be good at sports. But we also live in an area where there's little to no representation of anything but the majority. And so it was an accidental message that was received.
Gosh, it really does highlight what you were saying, the encouraging cultural exploration.
Mhm. And racial mirrors.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Wow, wow. So now, Leah, I imagine this work is exceedingly difficult because,
Mm.
I mean, you're working with the adoptee plus the family, so it's like family therapy. You're having
Yeah.
multiple clients. It's a lot to navigate. So there is definitely a sense of, I guess, resilience and stick to itiveness where you're continuing to do this work. So can you share with me any memorable events or circumstances that influenced how you got into this work?
Yes. I like to put it as it chose me. And I just kind of fell into this. So growing up, and whenever I was in undergrad, I worked a lot with a youth ministry as a youth pastor for a larger church, where I noticed, there were a lot of adoptees. Adoption is very common. And there was this one specific family that I became very close to, especially when I realized that I was the first Black woman in this child's life that looked like her. She's never really seen someone like me in the different roles and positions that I was a part of. And so I was also simultaneously, getting my psychology degree, and I just really fell in love with the process of getting to know the family and also the adoptee. Well, fast forward about a few years, I hear that there were some issues because I moved away. And so I hear that, this child has been like sent off to all these camps, all these things, even though I said, hey, I am here to help. I don't know if there's like a sense of not shame, but just wanting to be proactive with me not being there. So I hear at the end of all this that they send her back to the foster care system.
Hmm.
And I cried. I cried for so long because not only did they send her back, but they also wrote a parenting book. And it was kind of a gut punch, just not using me even as a last resort, but kind of going through the process of trying to clean up and assume it's the adoptee with the problem. And that was when I realized this happens a lot more than we like to talk about, where the adoptee goes back to foster care, even if it's years later. And from that point on, I vowed to make sure that happens as little as possible. Because if we're going to open our homes and our hearts to these children that are already coming from broken circumstances, I want to be able to prepare every family for the potential of conflict and prevent something so devastating as that. And so, luckily, that young girl is now a married, amazing mother who has become resilient and also a very key influence in helping me work with my clients today. So luckily it turned into a beautiful thing, but it was not a beautiful process at all.
Wow. Well, it's like like you said, it chose you, this process, this journey, this
Mhm.
career. It's
Yeah.
coming full circle where y'all
Yes.
are helping each other. Oh, that is beautiful.
Yes. She's
Ah,
she's incredible. Yes.
wow.
It's been
Wow.
great.
Now, thinking about in your journey as a woman of color, what were some challenges you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
I am a very passionate person when it comes to the things that I love. And passion can often be mistaken as stubborn and insubordinate. I'll say that if it does not come through the norm of how you do things. And whenever I'm also a person with ADHD, and so I'm neurodivergent. And so the way that I see the world is different on a whole nother level, but like cognitively. So whenever I seek out questions and just curious, because I'm a curious person, a lot of the times it's looked at as a negative thing. And I didn't realize that until I got into the workforce, that all these silent social cues and falling in line of, when you work for corporations, they're necessary for survival, even in the therapist world, and it which is really disheartening. And I feel like the cultural work environment is starting to shift towards being pro neurodivergent, but I got into a few situations where there were some misinterpretations, and so I have to advocate for myself, and then it turns into me creating those avenues for support. And yeah, but these are also the same companies who support DEI and diversity and inclusion. So it helped me realize that we do encourage these concepts of diversity, but we don't necessarily know how to confront it whenever it comes to a corporate level of maybe making some changes and adapting, especially if it's something that they've never done before. They kind of look at it as an inconvenience. So that's one example, I think, that really encompasses the way I've become this clinician who is passionate about advocating for people.
Because you've had to do so for yourself.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Wow,
Yeah.
this feels like a therapy session.
Not
Wow.
intended.
Yes, yes. Hey, well, I love
Yeah.
it. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and given what you shared, what does it mean for you to be an African American licensed associate counselor?
I take so much pleasure in what I do. I feel like because of all the things that I've gone through, I'm capable of connecting to with literally anyone because I love what I'm doing and I'm passionate about if I don't know what I'm doing, I'm going to get the resources to figure it out. So it's really fun to have the brain that I have and then also the cultural background that I have because it has made me figure out some very complex cases that otherwise other people would have to humble themselves to figure out. And I think it is so rewarding to be able to use things that make set me apart and have caused struggles and trials back in my younger career days, and now being able to mentor other younger Black clinicians or clinicians of color from a mentor perspective, that has been so fulfilling.
And you really care about the work and the people.
Yes, I do. I do. My family, my parents, they always laugh at me because they were like, "Well, Leah, we were worried about you growing up because you just literally would talk to anyone. We thought you were gonna maybe we turn around and you'd be gone." But that very element that I've always had just carried with me for the rest of my life, and now it helps me do my work to the most excellent way I can.
Yeah. It's like your willingness to speak with others really makes it easy for the adoptees to open up with you.
Yes, yes, and my willingness to mess up because I
Mm,
know that I am not perfect. Even as a Black clinician, I don't know everything, and I mess up when it comes to my own cultural bias. We all have them, and just because we look similar does not mean we go through the same thing.
yeah. And so how can we support you?
I think just continuing the work which would mean in this instance, educate yourself, diversify the voices that you listen to and educate yourself with. When it comes to CEUs, take more on diversity, and are the people that teaching diversity diverse? Like do the things, the hard things, without expecting others to hand you the information.
All right. Any final thoughts?
I don't believe so. This has been so fun.
It's been fun as well.
Yes.
And I actually learned quite a bit, as you were going through the different elements that clinicians should be considering are encountered with working with an adoptee,
Mhm.
even as an adult, because I would
Yeah.
imagine that if these opportunities were never brought forth as they
Mhm.
were going through the adoption process, and then of course come to adulthood, that
Mhm.
these conversations were neglected. And then so now they're in
Yeah.
a therapy room. And this is, I think, an opportunity for us as clinicians to broach this
Yes.
subject.
Yes. We're at the very beginning stages of a lot of the work, but adoptees have existed for a long time. So yeah, adoption is not a new concept. So yeah, I just encourage people to seek out resources, even if it's the one that my company provides. We provide trainings for therapists, for agencies, just for them to learn more about this process and what it looks like from an adoptee's perspective. I highly encourage people to do the education for the work.
All right, Leah. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you for having me.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.